guest speaker tonight is Dr. Kim Skirm from the Massachusetts Department of Agricultural Resources, where he serves as Chief Apiary Inspector and Apiary Program Coordinator, in addition to serving as President of the Apiary Inspectors of America. Dr. Skyrm has always been driven by an intense love of bees to serve in supporting roles informed by the latest scientific research. This is evidence since Kim has been working with native and managed bees, beekeepers, farmers, and pesticide applicators for the past 14 years through outreach, education, research, and extension. Dr. Skyrm has a bee's eye view of the world and is truly passionate about continuing to do work that preserves the viability and sustainability of bee populations. Dr. Skyrm, thank you for your service, and we look forward to learning about your work this evening.
Yeah, thanks so much again for having me. I sort of started out, I was really hunting for a good photo. I realized every time I do talks, I have to sort of change my background, and I feel a little bit of betrayal if I didn't at least put a native bee photo up here for my garden from last year. So I was like, oh man, I got to find a good looking bumblebee. So, sort of like a cat, I've had a lot of lives. I've done a lot of work in academia. Most of what my focus has always been on practical stuff. Like, what can you do, as a homeowner, as a gardener, as a public, as whoever, what can we do? And so I've worked with a lot of groups with that sort of lens and always coming from the aspect of bees. But my former life was working with bumblebees. So I actually have my Ph.D. working with bumblebees. So they're very near and dear. So if people have questions about them, maybe later, Adam, we can give a talk. I can do a whole talk about bumblebees. It'll probably be much more, interesting to some, maybe not. But my honeybee keepers, when I give my bumblebee talk to them, the wives always come up to me and say, I hate coming to these meetings with my husband. This is the best meeting I've ever been to. He's been asleep. I've been wide awake. Thank you so much for doing this talk. So I don't know, some folks really like the bumblebee talk, but so I'm going to actually sort of weave in bees a little bit today. So let me share my screen. So again, thanks so much for having me. We're going to talk a little bit about pollinators and hopefully give you a lot of information. Now, we're going to be really biased this evening because my work and interest is in bees. There's a lot of other types of pollinator groups out there, and even some like this cutie patootie down here on the bottom. This is actually a fly, not a honeybee, although it's a pretty good mimic. All of these were for my garden this year. So this is totally possible. I live right on the cusp of Berkshire County and Franklin County in the little big town with a big heart of Irving. So I'm not very far from you all. So I totally understand the area and the landscape. And gardening this year has been a task. I recently purchased a home and remodeled the outside. Once I said outside because the inside was not so much my interest, but the yard very much was. So it's been interesting to sort of see with having this lens on pollinators, kind of stepping back for this presentation. Most of what we talk about at MDAR has to do with honeybees, and obviously, like I said, my former life as a cat in the bumblebee world, I don't get to do that very much. But pollinators as a group is really a nice topic because what we are talking about, right, is such an essential group of organisms that I think not only has sort of captivated our attention in the public, but also I hope most people's has a really soft spot for them in their heart as well, because they are so important to the ecosystem, right? So pollinators, pollination, we all sort of understand that link. But I think what we miss sometimes is how the magnitude of that. So hopefully we'll share a little bit of data today that'll help you maybe get a little bit better understanding on how big that reach is. And the products for honeybees, even though it seems kind of silly, are also lumped into this as they're a significance of this group because they are a huge industry in agriculture and oftentimes a very quiet industry as far as being represented in data and often underlooked, even here in Massachusetts. And I'll give you an example when we talk a little bit about honey production. And then biodiversity wise, I mean, your whole group, this is your whole focus is to think about the environment through the lens of conservation. So you really, I'm preaching to the choir, so to speak, with this group in that lens, because you have much bigger, I think, appreciation of how important these organisms are in the biodiversity. And then, of course, in Massachusetts, we're such a unique area. We have to consider that. So I would be remiss because I was not sure sort of the audience. So I said, let's take us all back here a little bit to elementary school. It's always nice to have a refresher, and let's talk about what pollination is, because I think sometimes we sort of forget how elementary this is, but also how crucial this relationship is, because it's hard, right, to talk about pollinators without talking about pollination. So quite simply, we've got flowers for the most part need to have pollen transferred in a variety of ways. And those flowers, the parts of them obviously have pollen grains, and that's what's used whenever they're transferred to be able to fertilize an additional flower. And from that, hopefully they're going to make a fruit or a nut or a seed or something, a combination of those things. And obviously, if it's for agriculture, it's going to be associated with a crop. And if it's not, it'll be associated with a plant's survival. So that's where our biodiversity piece really comes into play here. Surprisingly, in the world, 75 to 95% of our plants that flower require some sort of animal pollination. And we can't be naive, even though I can talk about bees till the cows come home. We can't really be naive because there's a lot of other animals that do pollination. And even within the plant world, crops require 80% of them require some sort of animal pollination. And of course, honeybees tend to be the main one, and we'll talk about them for a little bit. Now, for animal pollinators, again, we'd be remiss if we can't mention the other groups here, because bees, by far, they're my favorite. And of course, all of you probably have seen them, and they're very visual and beautiful. But they're also just part of this bigger group and bigger collective. And this is such a great poster from 2006. If you don't have this one or haven't seen it, it's just such a great design to really shed light just on how diverse this group of pollinators can be. When you see these numbers, I mean, that's absolutely phenomenal. There's that many organisms on the planet that provide pollination services. So, bees may be the gateway insect, right, for pollination and pollination work, but they're definitely part of this bigger collective. So I just kind of want to start out with that really big lens. And now we're going to hyper focus on our bee friends here for a little bit. So let's talk a little bit about probably the most popular bee. If we were all on social media, this would be the TikTok famous bee of all the pollinator group, which is the honeybee. It has by far claimed the prize of popularity. 2006, 2007, this bee really took pollinator work and pollinator conservation to the next level. And what it did is it sort of shed light on how the problems with honeybee health could basically translate to other bees. And quite frankly, we've been having issues with bee health for a long time, way before colony collapse disorder occurred at that time period. And really, the media went crazy with it, sort of like the Asian giant hornet situation of today. Everybody has an Asian giant hornet. Nobody has an Asian giant hornet unless you live in Washington State. So the honeybee sort of became that beacon, that megaphone for bee health, bee conservation, which at this point has been really great wave to ride. Now, when we talk about honeybees, we're talking about something very different. There's only 9 species of honeybees in the world, and I'll show you a slide on bee diversity, so just kind of keep that figure in mind. But there are obviously a lot of bees in a single unit that act as a colony. So this would be a hive box, and inside of the box is a colony of bees. So typically these are maintained by beekeepers. We do have honeybee hives that are feral, but they're not native to the Americas. So those would be, at some point, came from a beekeeper. But they typically are in some version of these box setups. Now, this is very basic, but there's a lot of variation even how they're kept. So inside of a hive, you've got different components that I showed you on the previous slide, different parts of the box. And the way that this works is that beekeepers are able to pull out, this is called a frame. They can pull this out of the box. And this is where bees, think of this as if the house, the box, the hive itself is a house like humans would live in. The frames are each room of individuality in the house. So this could be their kitchen, this could be their living room. And sometimes even on the frame, you've got all those different rooms in one. So this might be the bottom floor of a house, right, versus the top floor. So on the frame, what you'll notice is they kind of think of a rainbow design. So the outer band of a rainbow would be honey. So that's what all the capped material is that you see around the edges of this frame. And hopefully folks like honey because it is super delicious. We'll talk a little bit about it. Inside of that, kind of the white area that's really hard to see that looks like little holes that are dark, that would be our pollen. They typically try to keep the food to feed the baby bees, the brood that's in the center of that's capped in wax. Those are developing bees. They try to keep the food as close to them as possible so it's easy for them to feed. It's more efficient. So this is what a frame of bees would look like. And obviously in a box or a hive, you would have multiple of these. So you'd have a lot more individuals, at the larger level. On the individual level, we've got 3 different types of bees in a honeybee hive. Fairly simple. You've got a queen, and most of you probably have a queen at your house in some version, whether it's your pet or your wife or spouse or whoever. We all have a queen. Just depends on how you want to classify it. Usually there's only one in a honeybee hive. They're really important, but also don't have a lot of power. And I'm share that with you because that might rock your boat a little bit. They actually don't make any decisions. They're controlled by these workers that make up the honeybee hive. And the workers in a hive are the most populous. Depending on the time of year, you can get up to all the way to 60,000 individuals in a hive, maybe even a little bit more. For us in Massachusetts, that typically happens around August and September. So this time of year, the hives are fairly well populated, but we're not at that peak. We're probably anywhere between, it depends on your location, but maybe 30,000 bees, maybe a little less. So about half that. And then, of course, we have our drones. They're only here. Those are our male bees. They're only here for mating. So they sort of hang out. They eat a lot of food. They take a lot of space up. They require a lot of energy. You can transfer that to another species if you would like, but I'm just going to leave it right there. So male bees tend to be a lot. But they do provide a good service because we need that sperm in the honeybee world to make other bees. And we could talk about bee mating. That'd be a whole nother presentation, but that's the individual level of the bees. So on this particular photo, you'll notice that the queen is attended to by these workers. So when I mentioned earlier that she doesn't have any power, and what I mean by that is she doesn't make any decisions. So the workers are controlling everything that she's doing. And you'll notice how they're sort of kind of around her in a circle. This is her court, and they will take care of her, feed her. She doesn't eat at all. She gets completely fed by them. They'll also herd her. So kind of like a sheepdog would be with sheep, they'll nip at her and move her around the hive as they need to force her to continue to lay eggs. She needs to lay about 1,000 to maybe 1,500 eggs a day. So it's a lot of work. But during that time, again, it's kind of a hostile work environment, literally, because they nip at her, they push her around, they do take care of her, but it comes at a really big cost. And so if she becomes weak or diseased or some other health issue, they will actually recognize the decrease in her queen pheromone and replace her. And so again, it looks like she has a lot of control, but really she's kind of a puppet. So it's a little bit different. So that there she is there in all her glory. She's beautiful. It's an awesome to be able to see them in the hive, but you don't see them too much like this in this fashion. Usually you just see the evidence of them, which would be the eggs that she's laying. So in a honeybee hive, the reason I focus on this is because the workers are literally the bee's knees. So there are all female bees, just like the queen. They do all the work. And within the hive, what's so fascinating about this is the work that they do is based on their age. So you'll notice if you get a chance, you can download this. It's great. Little book called The Complex Life of the Honeybee. It's available online. There's these really awesome charts. I just wanted to kind of show you a couple of them, at least to give you a little appreciation of how this works. So within the hive, you've got all these different tasks as they get older, about a quarter of their life as an adult. Now, this is not immature. This is an adult bee. So they've went from egg to adult after 21 days, about 3 weeks. Once they emerge at 3 weeks, for the first week and a half, they stay inside of the hive and do all these various tasks. At that point, they now go outside of the hive and start doing other tasks within that. And so they'll be doing, all different types of things. And eventually they end up with the last task before they end their lives as an adult worker, as a forager. So when you see honeybees on a flower, they are the oldest bees in the hive. They've seen it all, right? They've been there a very long time, right? 45 days, month and a half, maybe 2 months at this point from egg to adult to life ending. And they've been doing that foraging. So they literally sort of work themselves to their death. So it's a kind of a real hard life when we think about that. So, and while they're doing that, they're obviously visiting flowers to collect resources. And they feed their bees, developing bees and themselves nectar, which they can collect obviously from flowers, and pollen, which they also collect. And just a couple of kind of fun facts to get us prepared to talk a little bit more about pollination. These are actual numbers. So Tom Seeley is from Cornell. He's an awesome honeybee behaviorist and geneticist, and he spent a lot of time watching bees. So he was able to calculate how much resources they would collect from each one of their foraging trips. So just to kind of give you an appreciation, when you eat a jar of honey, say you eat the second line here, a 1 pound jar of honey, it took 2 million flowers for bees to visit to make that whole jar of honey. Now, to make the honey jar that's a 1 pound, it took them 52,448 foraging trips, which may include those 2 million flowers they had to visit to get that. So if we go to the grocery store and they're out of food and you're frustrated, at least you're not a bee, right? That's a lot of grocery store trips you'd have to make to get that one bag of groceries. So it's hopefully will kind of give you a little bit of an appreciation. Honeybees will also collect obviously pollen, which they use to feed the bees. That would be their protein food source. And of course, the nectar, which they turn into honey, that would be their sugar source. So It's a nice sort of balance to the diet. They do, in addition to those two resources, will collect water, or sorry, I have an accent. I'm from the South. If you haven't noticed, I'm not from Massachusetts originally, but they will also use that to cool the hive. So they make their own cooling system, their HVAC system in the hive. So they need to collect that. So if you're thinking about bees in the landscape, if you consider those pieces, they're going to go to flowers, collect pollen, nectar. They're also going to collect water resources from the area, and they also collect resin, which we don't have much data on that for this slide, about the resin from trees. So they need that to make what we call propolis. So those are the big resources that honeybees will collect. Native bees are similar, but they're not going to collect propolis, and they're probably not going to collect water in the amount of quantity that a honeybee hive would. Now, when we think about honeybee hives and we think about honeybees, why do they do this? What are they doing with all the food? Why are they visiting all these flowers? Well, obviously, they're using the floral resources, the flower, the pollen, the nectar to feed the developing bees. And we're gaining from that relationship pollination. And so just to kind of put some numbers to it, the value of pollination from honeybees is really amazing as far as the number of dollars and cents, right? So a little over 200,000, 200 to almost $600 billion worldwide just from these organisms pollinating, in 20 billion in the US alone. Now that means about $350 million in pollination contracts paid to beekeepers because of these services. So this is big business, really big business. Now we compare that to native bees, right? Because again, honeybees are one bee in a very large group of bees as an organism. And when we compare that to native bees, even though it's only $4 billion worldwide, this is free, right? You don't pay to have a native bee come to your field or pollinate your yard. They're already existing. So they're nature's, part of the ecosystem. They're the natural. And of course, these honeybees are much more managed. So the honeybee pollination is really interesting because not only is it such a huge benefit to agriculture, but it also comes at a cost. And we know this because bees are transported. You can sort of looks like an airplane map, right, of where airplanes fly. If you pull those magazines out behind the seat at the air when you're on an airplane, but they will actually go all over the country and pollinate crops throughout the season, and they get paid, right, for the pollination of these. And sometimes it's a handshake, and a beekeeper will make honey while they're pollinating a crop. Other times, most times, it's some version of exchange of monetary between the two. So we'll pay to rent beehives. And the biggest crop that gets them the most money and also requires the most amount of bees is this one. And if we were in a group with each other live, I would usually ask folks what this is. And most people would reply and say, oh, I think these are cherries, or maybe they're apples. Close. So these are indeed in the similar-ish, as far as they look, but they do require very similar pollination needs. Well, not so much to apples, but these are almonds. So almond pollination in California is the largest flowering event in the world, not the US, not California, not the West Coast, the entire world. There's 1.26 million acres of almond production. And it's all rooted in sort of the San Joaquin Valley of the middle part of California. If you ever get a chance, I highly recommend you to plan a trip out in February. You don't even need to ask, fly into Sacramento, rent a car, just drive, and you'll be able to see this. And it's really something out of anything of the realm of possibility. If you ever get a chance to see this and smell it, by the way, it's very fragrant. It's a huge business, about $6.1 billion in 2019. Haven't released 2020 yet, so I couldn't get you the latest on that. But obviously huge, big bucks for pollination and big bucks for crop. They also use the majority of the honeybee hives that are managed in the country. So the USDA group surveys beekeepers each year of their pollination because they are such a big agricultural commodity. And every year it's about 2.7 million honeybee colonies are managed in this country for pollination by beekeepers. And almonds, the production system is using 2.4 million of those. So the majority of the bees that we see that are large scale, not so much those in Massachusetts, because we have a lot of hobby beekeepers that are doing it for fun and not commercial. But the majority of the country, they have commercial beekeepers, and almost all of them are going to almonds at some point. So some of you might start thinking about this and putting some factors together and thinking, if we lump the entire population of the US just about into a very small area of California and told everybody, this is the only thing you have to eat, what do you think would happen? Probably would not be too great of conditions for humans. It is very similarly not great for honeybees. And because of that, we do see a lot of issues with bee health with this particular ecosystem. So although pollination is really important to our world, it also comes again at a cost, in this case to the honeybees themselves. But beekeepers are going to keep doing this because they make a ton of money at it, and because the almond industry is such a conglomerate, they need it. So they sort of drive that market price that you see there for $200 a hive. And that may not seem like a lot, but I'll give you a comparison. So if you get $200 a hive for almonds in California, you'll probably get, maybe, I'm trying to think, maybe 65 bucks a hive for cranberry pollination in Massachusetts. Very big difference, right? So it's definitely worth their money. Now, when we think about just pollination, right, that's a huge resource in agriculture, also comes at a cost, but we also neglect the fact that with that is also honey production. So while they're pollinating these crops, bees are obviously making honey because they're collecting the resources to feed themselves, their babies, but also they usually collect a surplus. If you have 30,000 bees or 60,000 bees in the box, and 15 or 20% of them are foraging, they're going to bring back a lot more resources than they can consume. So that's how honey is being produced. And beekeepers used to call this honey money. This used to be the biggest thing that would drive a beekeeper in their business, was how much honey they produced. And nowadays it's actually the opposite. It's actually how much pollination they can get. Honey is far less of a bigger portion of their business. And the reason is because of this slide. So if you ever get a chance, there's a great Netflix special on this. It's the first one. I think it's called Rotten. I'd have to look it up again, but it's a great show to sort of showcase this honey fraud industry. So I say this because I'll tell you in a minute, hopefully you'll buy local honey instead, but a lot of this honey is coming in that we consume. We can't produce in the US how much honey that is interested in being consumed. So we have to import honey in because the industry is so great. So beekeepers can't keep up with the demand, and they've never really been able to. Even this goes back a decade, but it's been going on for much longer than that. So it's really a weird business. And because of that, we get a lot of honey from other countries, and it comes at a much lower price and a very low quality. So the best thing to do to combat this is to buy local honey. And I was just in Cheshire actually a couple of weeks ago visiting beekeepers, and there was this darling little honey stand, I think by one of the local schools. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is literally in the Berkshire folks' backyard. I hope you've had a chance to see this. So I had to snap a photo, and I dug it out for this specific presentation because I thought it was adorable and also so important, and how you can see such an impact of having this local honey. And while there's only 6 jars there, it's amazing because those 6 jars, right now you have an appreciation. Each one of those is a 1 pound jar, 4 of them, and the other 2 are 2 pound jars. So you can imagine, we can do our math again of how many foraging trips it took for them to actually make that honey. But if you're curious on where to find honey and you're not too sure, if you don't have these little nifty stands by the side of the road, or you're not near Cheshire, I don't even know if they still have any of these. I bought one myself, so they're one less in this photo. You can also find the honey producers from the honey map. We do have a great mass grown map through MDAR, and most people are using it or have used it for other commodities. Actually, I know a lot of people that use it for their Christmas trees every year and for their turkeys, but you can actually use it for honey. So we were able to add that. And alternately, if you are a beekeeper in this meeting and you want to be listed as a honey producer, it's really easy to do that. So you can go onto the map, and there's a little form you submit, and they'll totally put you on as a data point. And it's really been a nice way for us to connect those local producers with people that want to have local honey. So I can tell you that we have primo honey in the Northeast, and I know we're biased because we live here and I'm very proud of it, but we really do. We have the highest prices for honey in the country, but I would argue we have the best quality. And I personally am somewhat of a honey connoisseur. People like wine and beer. I actually really like honey. So I've got honeys from all over the world every time I travel, and I've tasted it all. And I can tell you it is the best in Massachusetts. So just going to leave it at that. Pretty good in Vermont too. Just going to leave that there if you're a Vermont native, but really good in Massachusetts. So unfortunately, all of this is going to come to a head, right? Because we can't keep using bees for pollination without some sort of cost. Bees obviously have a threshold like any organism would, and honeybees specifically in this case. So Honeybees have been having issues long before 2006 and 2007 when colony collapse sort of rang an alarm bell. But what that did again is sort of really shine a light on how important they are and how much we needed attention to them. So what we've been able to do is collect a lot of data since that time period. And because it's been well over, for 15 years now, we've been able to get a really nice data set. And what we found out is that beekeepers are pretty much have consistently lost anywhere between 30 to 45% of their bees annually. Massachusetts, we're right in that cusp. Occasionally we've had a year, we've had like 60%, but most of the time we're hovering around 40 to 50%. Which it sounds like not a lot. I know I'm saying that with very little affect. And the reason I say that is because beekeepers are able to rebound from those losses. Most folks, you get into beekeeping, they're excited about it. It's awesome. I love it. I think it's wonderful. It's also really challenging. And so if you lose all of your honeybee hives, if you're 100% instead of 45, for instance, those folks tend to either get out of beekeeping or they really dig their heels in and say, I'm going to figure out how to do this. And so they'll actually stay in the hobby and figure it out. So, maybe that's with any sort of hobby. Commercial beekeepers, this becomes a very different issue, right? If you had a business and you lost 30 to 45 or 65% of your business or your employees or your inventory, your customer base, oh, you got a problem. So commercial beekeepers are really able to sort of keep this because what they do is they split these honeybee colonies that survive through the winter, whatever that looks like, wherever they're overwintering, Florida, here, wherever. And so we could talk about that later, but it's allowed them to maintain honeybee colonies. So in essence, what I want you to take home is that we're never not going to have honeybee pollination. The government never tells you never, but you can trust me on this. We're always going to have honeybees for pollination. We just may not always have 100% of live honeybees. We're probably going to have bee losses every year, but because of the way that beekeeping has evolved, we're going to be able to maintain that. So these numbers we are losing bees, but it is sustainable in the sense that we've got a lot of people doing good work. Now, the reasons behind the honeybee losses are also the reasons behind our native bee losses with a little bit different sort of focus. So the honeybee losses are sort of this wheel that you see here, and most of them also can be translated to native bees or really any other pollinator, with the exception of beekeeping practices, right? Because we don't keep native bees or native pollinators. And maybe the queen failure, depends on the species, but everything else here is applicable. So when we talk about honeybee losses, that's why it's been so lovely to have them as a spokesperson, because they do translate well. And all of these problems are the same. We've got habitat issues, we've got invasive species, and I know some of you mentioned that earlier. So you're already sort of on top of this and very much keyed into what the problems are. The issue here really is that there is also competition between these bees. So we see this really big faction right now with bee groups. You've got conservation groups and bee groups that are very diehard native pollinators that are anti-honeybees. And very rarely do you see the opposite. I don't seem to find beekeepers that are anti-native bees, but it's interesting. There's a real big kind of rift in the community. So I don't know if you're feeling that in your group, but I'd be happy to chat if you have things, questions or information that you need about that. But there's definitely some interesting kind of overlap occurring. But overall, really, we should be fighting for the same thing because they're both struggling in very similar ways. The big difference, right, is that you don't have as many, research dollars thrown at native bees and native pollinators like you do these honeybees, because the industry is there for them. So it's a very different driver. And colony collapse disorder, no longer a problem, not in the sense that we don't see it like we were seeing it in 2006 and 7. We haven't seen it for years. I've been at MDAR for almost 7 years. I've never seen colony collapse disorder in Massachusetts. I'm also, as you mentioned earlier, part of our national organization of apiary inspectors, both here in the US and in Canada. We have never talked about colony collapse disorder as a major problem. It's almost like it's the buzzword that you use, well, not we, but that people use, but it's not really prevalent anymore. So it needs to kind of get a little bit more of a different feel. The other things that I want to mention here, and this is where you can come in. So hopefully you don't feel sort of deflated right now, because there are ways that you can help. And the big thing that you can do as a homeowner, as a gardener, as a citizen, just as a human, is you can help reduce the way that you manage your landscape and reducing pesticide as input. You can also encourage, right, specific foraging plants for bees. Those are two things you can control. And of course, if you're a beekeeper, you can do a lot more of these, but that's a little bit different conversation because it depends on how you keep bees. So let's talk a little bit about native bees and sort of how they've been impacted by this. So this is a paper from, again, almost a decade ago that found that 4 species of bumblebees were having a really hard time in their area. And 3 of these are in our area in the range. We're in their range here in Massachusetts. So these 3 have had really suffered from mostly from habitat loss, pesticide use, invasive species, all the things we just covered. In addition to that, we were finally able to, real over almost 4 years ago, get this bee listed on the endangered species list. It was really quite a feat. So hopefully you've been sort of keyed into this. And if you haven't, it's a really good story to read, just how long this took to get something listed as endangered. Long story short, we used to have this bee in Massachusetts. So if you do see a bumblebee that's fairly large, and it's called the rusty patch because it has this kind of orange patch of colored hair on the abdomen. So if you see something like this, definitely say something, because it alert, either us at MDAR or Fishers and Wildlife, because this is something that is very rare, and they're trying to collect data now on how this nests. So, where it's nesting in the landscape. So that's, again, where you can get involved if you have a really keen eye to look. So we're not going to talk about honeybees much anymore. We're going to talk about native bees, because these are the fun group. So we got about 20,000 bees in the world, which is awesome. 4,000 North America, which is really cool. And about 400 in Massachusetts, which is honestly, for our little state, is pretty impressive. And of those 400 bees, they're basically in 5 different families. And of the families, the lowest number of species is in this Coletes group, which is kind of a fun one. I think I've got a photo of it. You can see it. Of course, the honeybees and the bumblebees and carpenter bees, they're all in the Apidae group, which is not the most number of species, but it's the second. And the largest group of bees that we have are in the Andrena group, and there's your mining bees. So they tend to be nesting in the ground, which we'll talk about next. Now, the bees on the bottom, the halictas and the melichiles, the halictas especially, they're almost always very brightly colored. And I think I've got some photos of them. And then the megachile bees are fun because they tend to nest in really specific places. So here's what a couple of our really beautiful bees look like. Now, what I want you to see, again, right, none of these are honeybees, because honeybees are so small in comparison to how much diversity is in the bee group. And of course, if you like bumblebees, like most of us do, they're also a very small group in comparison. Most bees are actually solitary, so they're not social at all. So bumblebees are social or eusocial, and honeybees are eusocial or social, whichever way you want to. We can talk about that distinguished later in different talk, but most bees live alone, or they live in groups, but they live alone. So think of like an apartment complex, but everyone has their own apartment. So no one shares kind of the daily lives, but they all have the same structure they share, the same piece of dirt they all build individual holes on. So beautiful, but also mostly solitary. Of the bees, what they like to eat, also we see something very different. Most bees are generalists, which means they go to a variety of plants, instead of a specialist, which means they go to very specific plants. Now, the specialist bees we do have in Massachusetts are really important because, again, if they only go to certain plants, we could really target those plants. So if you're trying to be intentional in your yard, there's a great website from Jared Fowler, who is an awesome bee taxonomist, who's made a really neat list of all the specialist and generalist bees and sort of what they feed on specifically for the Northeast. So you could look it up just for Massachusetts if you're really keen on that. And this is just examples, by the way, of trees. I haven't even touched on any other plant, but there are certain bees that only go to certain plants. And what's neat about this is if they are a specialist bee, they bring the food back because they're probably also a solitary bee, and they provision the cells with that food so their young also can understand what to forage on. Because I get that question a lot. It's like, if you're a specialist bee, how would you know if your mom doesn't raise you? Because solitary bees are not raised with brood care like social bees. So how would you know what plant to go to? Well, it's when you emerge, which is probably when your mom laid the egg. She knew how many days it would take to hopefully for you to emerge and the plant would be blooming, and what it smells like, what the chemicals are there. So it's so neat how they're able to line the nest with that, or what the nest material. So if they're collecting leaves or if they're in a twig, they can be in among the plant. Also within bees, most bees nest in the ground. They do not nest above trees, and they definitely don't nest in hive boxes like honeybees. So this should really start you thinking about how do you target a landscape and make it bee friendly if most of them are living alone, they're eating everything, and they nest in the ground. Those are big pieces of information for you as a homeowner and thinking about this, or as a land manager and or as a conservation group, how you can target your efforts for these bees. So, and as you mentioned earlier, which was so cool to hear, that you got these no-till projects going on, because again, right, these things are nesting in the ground. If you're going to get tilled up, that's a really sad way of losing your house. What you can do, there's 10 steps here that it's a lot of information, but it's fairly simple. And most of you, it sounds like, are already doing this. So, the biggest thing is to hopefully plant something in your yard. And we would love to see native plants going in the ground. We understand there's some issues sometimes with getting hands on seed or the quantity or trying to figure out what native plants. So if you're not able to always do natives, try to do something. Of course, not something invasive. That's much easier to find out information for, but definitely try to plant something. Provide a water source. It's really important. A lot of bees have a hard time finding access to water. The Berkshires, you're pretty fortunate because you've got a lot of areas, maybe Massachusetts, we've got a lot of areas that have access to water. And nest sites, we do not have an underabundance of nest sites in the state unless you're living in the city proper of Boston. And even then, a bee could probably find some sort of tree snag or a bare location of ground. I'll give you an example. Last year, I got a call from the city of Springfield. We get a lot of interesting calls in this job. And there were residents that were scared to death, and someone didn't want to take their children to a nearby park because bees had nested in the sand underneath the swings. And I thought, this is the coolest day at work. I said, give me the address. I'm going to hop in my car and go out there because this is an awesome opportunity to see these bees in their natural habitat. And this guy thought I was really off my rocker. He was like, what do you mean you want to come out here? I want to get rid of them. What do I spray? And I said, well, okay, we're not spraying anything. That's the first thing we need to talk about. So, these are opportunities, again, right, to educate around where bees are nesting. And it was really neat to kind of help this community understand there was no danger here. It was just more of hopefully appreciating the life cycle of these organisms. And then the piece around pesticides, which we can talk a little bit about, and hopefully get really excited about doing this. Whatever you do, share it with others. I know for my neighborhood, we have a lot of people that walk by on our sidewalk, and whatever I've done in my yard over the last couple of months, people notice it. They ask questions. They want to know what's in the ground there. Oh, that flower is really pretty. What is that? Or, oh, what does that sign mean? So really get an opportunity to use your yard as a billboard for pollinators, both in the plants that you put in the ground and the material that you use. So that's what you can do in your own yard. Now, the community side, it's much more difficult. Obviously at the conservation group, you all may have access to land and resources and grants that I heard you talk about, which is awesome. You're doing reading and learning right now, right? Hopefully you're getting something out of this. And then the citizen science piece, if you can report data when you see things or whatever you're planting, if you can give some information about it, and hopefully get political. We at the state are not able to get political, which is awesome because that would be a conflict of interest, but I can definitely direct people if they're looking for ways to do more pollinator work. The best way to start, the best source is with your local legislators. If you call them up or email them or hassle them or whatever you need to do, they're the folks that control the budget of the state house. We don't control that. And so if you want to see more dollars in pollinator habitat, you want to see more plants in the ground, you got to get those people to care and put a line item in the Massachusetts state budget. That's really the only way to get it, because we have no control. And it's tough because I can see a lot of people interested in that. And then that's the other piece, is donating time, donating energy, helping people be better beekeepers. So there's a lot of stuff there. So when I talk about the landscape and you all are doing this work, you have to really view it like a bee. And I know that sounds kind of silly, and you're probably thinking, what does that mean? Well, when you look at your backyard, what do you see? Do you see flowers? Do you see your car? Do you see grass? What do you see? Because the bee doesn't see any of that. What they see is what food can I eat? Where can I nest? What water resources can I get to? And am I going to get, they don't know that. Obviously, I'm putting human traits on them, but are they in a safe space? They're not going to get sprayed or dug up or eaten or hit by a car. That's what they see, are living factors. What do they need to survive? So that's how you have to view your yard. How do I give them nest sites? How do I give them water sources? How can I sort of tailor my yard so they can be more hospitable in this area? And something like this is great. You can put out these nest boxes. Bees will use them. This was literally in our neighborhood, a couple of doors down. This is, it worked. There's a lot of holes. You see a little face down there. they use this nest box. It is the most rattiest, not cute nest box of all of them that this person puts out, and the bees prefer it. And the reason is because they have oriented to it. So what we're doing is we have multiple generations in this nest box of the same, lineage of bees. So they've been able to keep coming back to it. But these nest boxes can be a little bit difficult because you have to clean them, and you need to make sure that if you're using these tubes that they don't transmit diseases. So this can have a little bit of a caveat to it. It's not as easy as just putting it out and hoping bees use it, but it is definitely at some sort of step. The other thing is planting something. So, this is the same person. You'll notice their yard. They've been very intentional about planting something that blooms all year long. And this is something I noticed with gardening groups when I give talks at the Cape. People they're always really interested in how to make their yard pop. I want my yard to look so amazing. I want it to light up from the space station. I want someone to say, man, there's Kim's yard right there. Well, with bees, it's not so much about quantity as it is quality and availability. So how much is available is great, but also, is it the flower shape they can go to? Does it have enough pollen and nectar? Is it something where they can go to it throughout the season, as in the sense that you have something always available? Think of it as a buffet. If you're going to go, I know Massachusetts doesn't have these, but in the South, that's the only way you eat is go to a buffet. You would go in, if there's no food to eat, you would leave and go to a different restaurant. If there's a couple of things, depending on what it is, you might hang around. But if the whole thing is really stocked, man, you're going to take your plate and get a little spoon of this and a little spoon of that, and you're going to be really excited about it. And that's the way bees are going to view this. They want to have all those resources available throughout the season. The other thing is pay attention. I know this looks ridiculous, but if you can spend some time on your knees looking at bees, you're going to get an appreciation that you've never had before. And I know that sounds ridiculous. It probably does not look very interesting, and maybe you have bad knees, but get a chair, whatever you need to do. You can learn a lot about what bees are on your flowers, what is working in your yard, and quite frankly, just what's there, because I think you'll be surprised if you spend a little time looking what you may actually see. And this is something that I think we all sort of dream about, right? This is the Pinterest version of how to do this well. Most of us don't have resources to do this like this, whether it's money or materials or yard or whatever. But the idea, right, is that something's always in bloom. There are things for bees to nest in. This person's got brick, they've got bare ground. Bare ground is a big one, by the way. So we love our mulch in Massachusetts. We love mulch. We are the mulch industry here. We want to mulch every plant all the time. But mulch is not a great resource for our ground nesting bees, which is what most of the bees are. So you got to think about that. If it looks unsightly, doesn't mean that it's not functional. If you have to explain to your neighbors why there's a bare patch in your yard with no mulch or no grass, then maybe you don't need to be besties with that person, because they're not trying to help you be a bee steward. So, you do you, but I think it's really a good thing about a conversation, because I had a beekeeper once that was keeping bees, and they had a phenomenal nest of coletes in their yard. Thousands of holes. And the lady was so fun about it that she actually roped it off like it was like a hazard area. It was really cute, and had cones and signage. And so when she had people come that were working on her house as repairmen, she was very protective of this one little spot. And when I say little, it was probably maybe 10 by 15 feet of an area, but it was enough that she was really protective of it. If you drove up and had no idea what was happening, you might think they're doing something with the septic system or something. It looked like that, but it worked, and it was very easy for her to put that in, but it made a difference. So if you want to see where your yard is, here's some homework for everybody. You can actually get a report card on your yard. This new app called Beescape will let you put your address in for free, by the way, and you can look and see what your yard is and how it's graded. Now, you have to kind of take this for a little bit tongue in cheek, because it is doing as best it can with the layers that it has, but the goals is still the same. You can at least get some idea of your neighborhood or your area of kind of what the report card is for pollinator habitat. So it's a fun way, I think, to really look more locally in your yard and say, hey, am I doing a good job here providing food for bees? The other thing that you can do is, we did release a couple of years ago during COVID, which is a bummer, didn't get as much traction, but we did release this really nice guide to native plants that you are Massachusetts specific. So this is a great way to learn more about plants that are available, through the different seasons, colors, all of that, that you can purchase. So this is available online. So write this link down. It's a really nice one. I have a printed copy of it when I go to the nursery for my own yard, right? I pull it out and when I look at the little tags to see if some of the plants are on the list, or I ask for certain plants. If I'm looking, hey, I want something that blooms that's white flower, where do I find this plant? If you need more help, there's an even better guide. So you can go in, for instance, with this particular app, you can actually plan your whole yard out based on just pollinator specific plants, and it'll let you sort of customize everything. So, it's amazing. If you can take a picture of your face and try on glasses virtually for the eye doctor, you can definitely design a pollinator garden. We are at that level. You know what I mean? So there's so much availability for technology. And if you don't have access to this, or you don't feel comfortable using it, then if you go back to this guide and just print out the list, this is an easy way to do it too. If you really like this kind of thing, you can even download this app on your phone. So it even gets even better. You could sit in the garden store with your phone and say, man, I really like this plant. It's beautiful. What is the name of it? Where does it grow? That kind of thing. And it'll also help you, I think, especially if you're buying stuff from Home Depot or Lowe's or the big box stores, if it's not sort of properly labeled, to understand what it is. Or if you go to something like the Bridge of Flowers and you walk around and you see something that you think is beautiful and you're like, man, I really want to put that in my yard, you can look it up really quickly with this app if it's not labeled. So I know I've used the Bridge of Flowers a lot because it's amazing, right? It's like the best pollinator walk on the planet. If you don't know what the Bridge of Flowers is, it's in Shelburne Falls. I'm sure you all must, but if you don't, it's definitely worth it. It's free. You just walk along the bridge. Everybody that comes to visit me from Georgia, I always take them to the Bridge of Flowers. I'm like, man, this is awesome. So the other thing to do, and this is the butterfly bush, so take that with a grain of salt. It's not native, obviously. In most states, it's considered invasive, but not listed from invasive yet for Massachusetts. But if you don't know what pollinator plants to buy, if you still don't have access to any of this, and you're like, man, I don't know what to get, this sounds really ridiculous, but just walk around the store and see where the bees and butterflies are. If they're on the flowers of these plants, and they're probably a good pollinator plant. And if you look closely at this photo, there was a half a dozen monarchs here, several other species of butterflies, bumblebees out the wazoo, honeybees in this. Now it is butterfly bush, so we can talk about that, but we're just going to act like it's not. But still, if you walk around, see where they are located, because they're going to tell you, if you don't have any other resource, what they're preferring and what's attractive to them based on what they're visiting. So just take a look, spend some time seeing what bees are on. We also launched an initiative this past year called Growing Wild for Pollinators Initiative. We partnered with our sister agency at Department of Conservation Resource and gave out these really fun little pollinator kits. I think they only were able to give out 100 of them, but their goal was to have people who may not have had access to pollinator plants or didn't have enough, were trying to figure out what to put in their yard to get this little kit. And it came with a plant, it came with a seed packet, and it also had some information about pollinators. And all these were all native, by the way. So it was a really great way to put more kind of interest and work into this. But hopefully we'll be able to keep doing stuff like this. The last thing I'll leave you with is don't cut your grass as often as you've been cutting it. And this is a research actually from Springfield, so not very far away. And researchers at UMass were curious about this. So she had a whole bunch of students go out into neighborhoods and say, if we mow your grass, can you be part of our research? And they were like, sure, you can mow my grass. Great. And what they did is they found out if they didn't mow, if the lawn was unmowed for 2 weeks, they had very high bee abundance. And by the way, these are literally just neighborhoods. This is nowhere natural. This is just regular old suburbia in Springfield proper with people with lawns. That's it. No real pollinator gardens. They only looked at the lawns. And if they mowed their grass every 3 weeks, they had obviously more flowers that were available, but they had more bee diversity. And they found 111 bee species just in the grass in Springfield. There was nothing else. That's all they looked at. So I always show this because I think, we sort of, again, we go to Pinterest, we think, man, it has to be so amazing, it has to be so over the top. Really what it has to be is just thinking about the landscape, right? What does a bee see when they see your grass? They don't see, oh man, you have a bald patch, you need to fill that in. They say, can I nest here? Can I eat here? Can I raise my babies here? Can I get water? That's what they're looking for. That's the way you have to think about this. So I share that because it's always a fun one. And again, in the backyard. Now, I'm not suggesting that this should be your front yard, but if it is, if you look closely, there's a lot of bees on these daffodils. So yeah, there's a lot of ways to do this. And I think, you know, in our minds, we sort of go to the extreme, but there's definitely a benefit to having both of this. Actually, let me turn on the light, everybody. I'm in the dark. My neighbors are going to think I'm weird over here sitting in the dark. Okay. So the last thing I'll leave you with is whenever you're thinking about your yard, definitely consider what pesticides you're using, and not just what you're spraying on the plants, but know that bees, because again, most of them are nesting the ground and are going to be using plants to build their nest sites. They're going to get way different access to pesticides than just being sprayed on a flower, or actually visiting a flower that's sprayed, or visiting a plant that's sprayed. The EPA is just starting to get some really great data on ground nesting bees. So I'm hoping, we'll see, it's the federal government, it takes a long time, but I'm really hoping that we'll get some data, you know, in the next several years about how to consider ground nesting bees on our labels, because that is definitely a group that we don't have a lot of information for. On the labels of these pesticides, you will see language related to bees, mostly for honeybees. There is some bumblebee work that's been done as well on the labels, looking at risk and toxicity. But most of this is omitting ground nesting bees. And hopefully, if you take away nothing tonight, most of our bees are ground nesting. So we really need this information. So I'm excited to see what they're going to come out with. We also released a pollinator protection plan several years ago. It does need a good revision, so I'm hoping we can revise that in the next couple of months here. We'll see. And it's got some really great tips. Most of this is very, you know, basic elementary type stuff, but if you're looking for another guide, this is something that we worked on, and it, you know, does need a revision, but it's a good basis. And I'll leave you with the last little bit here to preach it from the rooftop. So again, if you have a yard and you're really proud of it, if you've done anything related to pollinators, you know, get a sign, put something out. Even if you don't see your neighbors or don't chat with them, you know, people do take notice. And if you have the signage in your yard, or even the properties that you're managing, it will get a lot of attention. And I think, you know, these are all different signs that people can use. You can buy some of these. But most of them are available. And of course, it definitely will get you more interest, and people will hopefully take away whatever you're doing. They'll look and say, man, look at that flower. It looks awesome. Or, I wonder why there's a bare spot in the ground. Huh? Let me read the sign. Oh, wow, bees could nest there. I had no idea. So little stuff like that makes a really big difference. I'll leave you with a lot of resources if you want to learn more about bees. Most of these are available commercially. A couple of them are PDFs on the internet, so you can print them out. My favorites are, if you want to learn about honeybees, there's going to be a new edition of this book next year, but it's a good one. This Wild Bees of New England is a little pocket guide, and the folks up at University of New Hampshire made a bunch of these a couple of years ago, and I wish they would redo it, but I think that professor left. But it's a great little pocket guide. So if you want some of these, let me know. I've got a little batch of them left in the office. So yeah, so just some great resources. And these are, again, there's a lot more than this out there, but these are some of my favorite ones. The last thing I'll leave you with is, if you want to learn more about beekeeping, even though we didn't talk too much about that tonight, you can definitely visit the Massachusetts Beekeepers Association. They've got a lot of bee school offerings, and bee school is exactly what it sounds like. You become a student in a classroom setting, whether it's virtual or in person. You attend it periodically, weekly, monthly, however it's set up. You pay a really small fee. Most of these are less than $50, and you get instruction on how to become a beekeeper and learn all about honeybee biology. So it's a great way to learn about honeybees, and also a good gift. So if you do partake in holidays, then this might be a nice one for you to think about. If you've got a hard person that you never know what to give a gift for, bee school is a really cool gift, especially if they're interested in bees. All right. The last thing to notify you about, and I know we're out of time, is our bee event that we have coming up. So we've got a couple of series of events. We've got a lot of events that we just posted on our website, but the one that's coming up, the most sort of relevant here for this group, is in December and also in March. So we do these, what we call State of the State. So we'll do a version of this talk, but much bigger focus on data collected by the program. And in this case, also the latest updates on pesticide use in Massachusetts and or how it relates to bees. So definitely want to note these. They're on the website as well. If you go to mass.gov, mass.gov, you can type in honeybee or apiary program, and we're almost always the first link that comes up. There should be a little box on our homepage that says education, and you'll see these listed. So they're free. Just grab the Zoom, join in. They are a 2-hour time block, so you don't have to come for the whole thing, but there's usually 2 presentations on each in the evening. So something to think about and share if people are interested. And then finally, if you're doing educational events, I know we're all starting to come back from COVID. We do have a lot of these native bee posters, native pollinator posters that were made by local artists. Also, I say released during COVID, so they didn't get as much traction, but they're really awesome. Don't have as many of the stickers. I think I'm out of the honeybee ones, but I do have some of the fritillary ones. So if you're interested and you're doing outreach events, we totally can send you a care package to hand out. Or if you just want to geek out and have one of these, let me know. I'll be happy to send you one. So yeah, really great resource. And hopefully we'll be able to do a series of these. The next one we would like to do is for agriculture. And then we will hopefully do another one for non-native, but like horticultural plants that are good for pollinators. So that's our goal, to have like a 3 series. All right. That's it, everybody. Thank you for listening. And I really appreciate you being here. Hopefully you got something out of this. If not, maybe you just got to hear a person with a foreign accent talk to you for an hour, 40 minutes here, or see some really fun bee photos. Yeah. And again, all the photos are taken from Massachusetts, and most of them are taken from my own yard because it's the easiest material to get to. So there's all local. But thank you again. I'll be happy to answer questions. And again, I know folks are trying to get out of here, so don't want to keep you, but thanks so much for the invite and for your time.
Thank you so much, Kim. That was absolutely amazing. I learned so much, and I personally, as well as I believe the board, just really appreciates the work that you do, but also the content that you shared with us tonight.